Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for the invitation to come here to Budapest and to talk about this very important subject of crime prevention. I would also like to thank the organizers for a very interesting conference. This has been has spanned widely from team building in Austria and Szeged and to structures of the brain. And the title of my talk here is cost-benefit analysis, so this actually brings a new perspective altogether. So maybe a final perspective of the day than what we have seen until now. First, this is the contents of what I would be saying. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am, because not that I don't want to talk about myself, but rather to put this into perspective, what I do and what this has to do with crime prevention and what is perhaps different from what the other speakers has talked about. Then I'm going to say a little about what I think is the reason that why cost-benefit analysis is important. Then I'm going to show you a method for actually calculating a cost-benefit analysis and talking about the data sources that we need to do a sufficient cost-benefit analysis. This, of course, will have to do with crime prevention, but in principle, we could do the same thing for other areas as well. Finally, I'm going to talk you through one example from my home country of Denmark, where I'll show you how this method actually works in practice, and show you some numbers also that I think actually are a little bit interesting, and I think also are relevant for the Hungarian case. So, who am I? As Katalin said, my name is Rasmus Jacobsen. I work as a senior advisor at a small center at the Copenhagen Business School. I'm an economist. I have a PhD in economics, and I do economic consulting and economic research. And I have more than 10 years of experience in doing quantitative analysis on, in particular, Danish data and individualized data and from Denmark. So I have a lot of sort of quantitative calculating experience, but it's sort of important here that I don't know much about, for instance, criminology, and I don't know much about any actual crime prevention programs. So I've never taken part in any crime prevention programs, and I've never been to visit even a crime prevention program. So I have sort of no knowledge whatsoever of the practical side of all this. I'm sort of just calculating the numbers afterwards. Also, I'm not going to talk much about the non-economic effects of crime, so this is going to be sort of a number exercise. I'm going to show this is how we use numbers to sort of calculate the value of crime prevention projects. So we're not going to take non-economic effects into account. So why is cost-benefit analysis important, or why do I think it is important? Well, I think it is important because in the modern society, this is true in Hungary and Denmark, in Germany or elsewhere, there is a large competition for funds, basically. So every time you have a project that you want to carry out, you basically have to apply somebody for the funds to carry out this project. It could be that you have to apply to the government, or you have to apply to some sort of private foundation, or whoever who can fund this project. And I think cost-benefit analysis is important because then you can actually come up with some numbers showing, okay, this project here is actually worth, say, X euros when we have done it, and when we have sort of going through the years and say, okay, so we can actually use numbers to say, okay, this project is actually important. Also, it is important because it adds an economic measure to the measures that's also used in the evaluation of crime prevention projects. We have a lot of crime prevention projects out there in this country and in other countries, and many of those are evaluated and are using different methods, but this sort of adds another method to it and enables us to say something about the economic side of all this. This method for cost-benefit analysis that I'm going to show you in a while measures only economic benefits, as I said before. So the results that are not sort of easily quantified, we have left them out here. What that could be is, for instance, The fact that reduced crime will sort of have us all feel a little bit better and more secure when we walk the streets at night. There could be also that we have to, that's for sort of for all of us, but I mean, even for those delinquents who actually don't commit crimes will also feel better, and that sort of self-esteem effect is not sort of quantified here. There are methods that could be used to sort of quantify these effects also, and sort of, but I'm not going to talk about them here because that's actually quite difficult and it takes a lot of time, and I think the results that come out of this method are also very important. So what do we do when we have to carry out a cost-benefit analysis? Well, the starting point is that most effective evaluation of crime prevention programs will focus on recidivism. So how many delinquents actually go out and commit new crimes after they've been through the program, and sometimes you compare them to a control group, so you have a participant group and a control group, and you measure the recidivism rate for these two groups, and you sort of say, okay, if there is a better results from the participants group, then that's the effect of the program. My argument is that an effective crime prevention effort may actually have effects also on other variables, or other apart from sort of actually only committing crimes. What we can see in the data, and that's also what I'm going to show you in a little while, there are actually, once you stop your criminal career, you actually increase your likelihood of completing education, and you increase your likelihood of coming into employment, and then you have to receive lower welfare benefits, and other family support measures will also be lower for people who have a better connection to the labor market. So I believe, and I think that this, the only right way to do a cost-benefit analysis is that we should take all these effects into account as much as we possibly can. The principle for doing a cost-benefit analysis is actually quite simple. First, you have to calculate all the benefits and the costs, and then you subtract the costs from the benefits, and the resulting number is basically whether you have a profit from the project or not. So if you have a positive number, means that there is an economic surplus, and a negative number means that there is an economic loss. In practice, this is not quite that easy. I've written up a formula down here on the slide, which is on the bottom part, and you can see that's sort of quite complicated. Fortunately, this doesn't have to be that complicated. It doesn't have to be that complicated. This is sort of a very general formula that sort of takes all the different variations into account, and I'm going to show you another formula in a while for the Danish case that is much simpler and much easier to understand. But if we can see, just have one look at the formula, what we can see is that we actually have the first term is the benefits and the second term is the cost. So what we do is that we subtract the cost from the benefits, and then we get the total results in the end. There we go. Okay, so what we need now, in order to carry out this cost-benefit analysis, we need some data. We need some data on the projects, and we need some data on these individuals that are in the control group and in the participant group of the project. First, we need some costs of the project in question. So what does it actually cost to carry out this project? Well, I mean, many of you have maybe worked with sort of budgeting and accounting because you administer some sort of project, and you basically already know what sort of this means. But what is important here that we need to include both the direct and indirect costs of a project. So this could be not only sort of the day-to-day work with these young delinquents, but also in administration and overhead costs sort of in total, because we need to get the total cost of the project. Secondly, we need some data on the effect of the program. So this was what I talked about before. We have this share of individuals that are actually helped from the program. This could be 5% of these individuals in the project are helped more from this project than they have been from other projects. or even, and if there isn't an evaluation of this sort of project that we're looking at, maybe we can find effect measurements of similar programs from the literature. Some programs have been well tested, for instance, in the United States or Canada, and we could use sort of these effect measures as a proxy for the effect that we believe the effect could be if we carry out a similar project in our own local environment. Then we need to find out what kind of measurement variables do we need. Obviously, we need the crime-related costs. So what are the costs to society from crime? Well, the cost to society from crime is that we have to do policing, we have to do prosecution, we have to do corrections, and we have to there are also some insurance costs, etc. But then there are also these other costs that I mentioned before, that actually individuals who commit crimes are more likely to be recipients of public transfer. They're also more likely to have higher health costs, actually. They are more or less likely to have a higher labor income. They earn less in the labor market. And of course, when they earn less in the labor market, they also contribute less in taxes to sort of the financing of the state and of the government. So how do we collect these data? Well, to start out with the effect measurements, for cost-benefit analysis, for obvious reasons, we prefer quantitative evaluations. We need some sort of a quantitative measure of the effect of a particular program in order to be able to carry out a calculation. I'm totally aware of the fact that qualitative evaluations has a very important point to play, and it also comes from what we heard earlier today, that it is important to know not only if it works, but also how it works and when it works. So that's a very important part of any evaluation, but it's basically not what we need here. Here we need quantitative evaluation. We need some sort of a number. We need maybe a percentage of individuals who are helped. Okay, so how do we get data for these individuals that are actually in the projects? Well, there are different sources from that. So from Scandinavia, where I come from, we have very excellent register data about the population. So we know people's income and people's sort of recipients of public welfare. We know that actually their health costs, etc. We have a whole lot of different, very good individualized data from that. And I'm aware that these data do not exist in every country. But there are many surveys in countries where actually you measure also these income and recipient variables, and you measure. You can also have knowledge about how much health care they use, etc. So these survey data could be used to construct groups, sort of target groups for the crime prevention efforts, and to measure their sort of stylized costs, not the actual cost, because if it's a survey, we don't know the exact people that are actually using this project, but we can sort of say that, okay, we have a group of individuals that looks very much similar, and we could use their numbers sort of as a proxy for the actual numbers for the project. Okay, one important assumption in the way that we carry out cost-benefit analysis is that we sort of allow ourselves to translate the effect that we measure on recidivism into the effects of similar size in the other areas. The reason we do this is not because we think that's the best thing to do. It's basically because there aren't that many evaluations who actually measure other variables than recidivism. So since we don't have any other knowledge, we basically need a number also to calculate effects for other areas. One thing that should be mentioned about survey data is that survey data are most often only relatively short time spans, and so we basically don't know much about what happens to these individuals over a longer time span, and we will have to leave that out of the calculation here. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the next point here. This is a cost-benefit analysis from Denmark. As you can see now, the formula up there is much simpler than it used to be. The first part is basically the unit costs of an area, which is the PI. The QI is the measured effect. So this is basically the effect. What is the effect from participating in one project to another project? And the C is the cost. So this is basically, okay, how much money does it cost to take one person through this project? And we can calculate the most easy way to do this is basically take the total cost of the project and divide by the number of participants, and you get an average cost per participant. And that's a perfectly good measure for you to use in this area. So we should see that, okay, as compared to the formula that we saw before, which had a lot more arguments in these functions, now it actually depends only on the area that we look at. So this could be health, it could be crime prevention, it could be public transfers and incarceration, etc. And it depends on time. So what happens in year number 1, in year number 2, in year number 3, in year number 4. And the cost that we have here is basically just calculated per person. So this formula gives sort of the resulting value of the cost-benefit analysis for one person that go through the project that we look at. So this is an average number per person. We cannot say anything about the one particular person, but we can say for the program as a whole, the average number per individual will be this. So, and if we need sort of to aggregate up to find the total number, we basically just have to multiply this average number by the number of participants. Say there are 100 participants and we end up with an effect of €1,000, then we per person, then we multiply these 100 participants with €1,000 per person, and we end up with a total benefit of €100,000. Okay. So in this example from Denmark, we use data about delinquents from Denmark in 2005, and we look at how they fare with respect to these number of variables that I've already talked about during the years from 2005 to 2009. So delinquents have been identified from these registers that I said before. They are anonymized, but we can access sort of these registers, and we can merge information on crime registration with a lot of other information. So, for instance, labor market variables and health variables and welfare benefits, etc. What we do is that we divide them into groups, and I will show you the groups that we use on the next slide. But what I want to mention here is that the groups that we use here is probably what we believe are the right groups to use in this context. But it may not be the case that if one of you wants to carry out a cost-benefit analysis for any project, it may not be the same groups that you have to use. So, for instance, if you have a particular group of particular projects that is targeted towards young females, then obviously you need to sort of only use females for your control group and for your groups. It could also be that you have a particular project that is targeted towards immigrants or whoever, and then you should sort of, the group that you look at should be defined on the basis of the project that you actually analyze. So that's just to say that these groups that we use here are good for this Danish evaluation context, but it may not be the right groups to use in another context. Okay. So as I said before, we have delinquents that we observed the delinquents in 2005. Basically, we observed the entire Danish population of young males between ages 15 and 25, and we can divide them into 3 groups. 5 groups. These 5 groups are the ones that we use in this evaluation. The reason I have put up the Danish words here is that the figures that I'm going to show you on the next slide, unfortunately, I only have the Danish titles in them. But it's no big deal that I will talk you through it, but it's just so that you can see it. Group 1 is the one that contains the law-abiding youth. So this basically all the youngsters that have not been registered as have committed any crimes at all. Group 2 are light criminals, so this is the hardest sentence that they have to have, is that they have received a warning or a fine or have their charges dropped without conditions attached. So this is this is in different steps sort of in the judicial system in Denmark. Then there are more hardened criminals where the hardest sentence is that they could be having had a suspended sentence. They could have dropped charges with conditions attached. This basically means that you have to attend some classes or you have to do specific conditions that have been attached to the fact that you have your charges dropped. Or there is a sentence that's called a youth contract, which basically means that you have to do some specific stay at a specific time or stay at home at a specific time is different. So very hardened criminals, group 4, you have had received exactly one unsuspended sentence. That means that you have been in jail or in a youth facility. And most hardened criminals are the ones who have actually had more than one unsuspended sentence. Okay. Next. So this slide shows the distribution of Danish young males aged 15 to 24 in 2005. So these are, fortunately, we can see that the very big one to the left, sorry, is those who are law-abiding, and then obviously groups 2, 3, 4, and 5 are those who have committed crimes. And also, fortunately, we can see that as groups get smaller and smaller as we move from left to right in the picture. I could say that the 260,000 on the left side corresponds to roughly 6 out of 7 Danish youth who have not been registered as having committed a crime. And 1 out of 7 then belongs to one of the 4 groups of young criminals. But also we can see that actually group 2 is about the same size as groups 3, 4, and 5 put together. So group 2 was the one who had actually had dropped charges or fines. So there are basically only about 7% of the population of the young males who have had harder charges or harder sentences than a fine. Okay. So these is the figures where unfortunately I only have them in Danish. But what you should see is that if you look at the numbers, is that as you move on the left-hand side downwards, you go 1, 2, 3, and on the other right-hand side is groups 4 and 5. So basically, the solid black line is the law-abiding youngsters, and the solid gray line is those who are most hardened criminals. So this figure is indexed. So what does that mean? It means that we have said, okay, let's set the number for those who are law-abiding to 1. So this basically shows the relative size of employment for the other groups relative to those who are law-abiding. So when the curves are below, it means that they have a lower employment share, and when the curves are about the same, it means that their employment share is about basically approximately the same. So what we can see here from this figure is that the 2 groups with the most hardened criminals have actually got very low employment share compared to the ones that are less hardened criminals. So basically only about 60% of those who are hardened criminals have a job when you compare to the law-abiding youngsters. So this actually means quite a lot, of course, for the average income. So these since 60% of these though are in a job, there are a lot of them who are not in a job, and they have sort of no labor income, and they have to receive their income elsewhere. And this basically means that you have so that you have less labor income, less tax receipts, and more expenditures on welfare. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So this slide is similar, only what we see here is the amount received in education benefits. In Denmark, you are entitled to receive education benefit when you go to, for instance, university. You are entitled to receive an education benefit from the state. So what this number says is that this is a proxy for the number of persons going to education. Because if you are entitled to receive a benefit, most people take up this benefit because it would be stupid otherwise. So you actually receive this benefit for going to school, right? And then, so this is a very good proxy for the number of for the share of individuals going to school. So what we can see here is that, again, we have indexed this so that the share, the number, the amount of education benefits received by the law-abiding group has been set to 1. So what we can see is that those who are most hardened criminals actually receive only about 1/3 to 40% of the amount of those who are law-abiding. So this basically means that a much smaller share of this population goes to school, or go to university, or go to vocational training, or wherever. So basically, they don't take education. So this, obviously, sort of from a pure economic point of view, this is actually something that saves the government money, right? Because you don't have to pay education benefits to these people. But that's sort of a very short-term saving, right? Because we would like to put this money into use, and this is sort of an investment for the future that we have to get these people to take an education. But it's a very good proxy to show that they don't actually take education. Okay, so what we include in this cost-benefit analysis is, in addition to the variables that we have already shown, is that we include social security benefits, early retirement benefits, healthcare utilization, tax payments, and labor incomes. And all these variables have been measured for all of the 5 groups that we showed, that I showed you before. So the principle here is that we want to sort of measure the effect of a crime prevention project from sort of preventing people from climbing one step up the ladder. So suppose you are a criminal that you have sort of reached some level. Maybe you have received a fine earlier because you have been shoplifting or something. Okay, so now we want to sort of aim a crime prevention project at you or your peers. And then, okay, so what we do here is that we say, okay, if we hadn't given you this program, then you would have had some sort of probability of climbing the ladder. So you would have continued to be criminal, you commit more crime. So we reduce this probability a little bit. So only a smaller share of these people will actually climb the ladder and continue into further education. So this is how further criminality. So this is how we measure the effect of the program. Again, this is important sort of for the calculation that we assume that the effect on the crime prevention effect can be translated also to the effect on the other variables such as tax payments and healthcare utilizations. Okay. Also, as I said, we need some costs of crime. So these are sort of typical crimes committed by these 5 groups. Obviously, group 1 hasn't committed any crimes, so they basically have 0 costs with respect to crime. And these other groups are we have attached typical crimes to these groups, and then we have calculated the effects, the total costs of police, prosecution, defense lawyers, help lawyers, courts, etc. For each of these. And these are some calculations that we have carried out in cooperation with the prosecution office, the Danish police, and the Danish National Crime Prevention Council. And obviously these are sort of very stylized numbers, right? Because we don't know the exact numbers, but we have sort of made an estimate of the time used in these different areas with respect to the different crime types. So what we see here is that obviously groups 2 and 3 are not that expensive, but as you move along the criminal ladder, you sort of end up being actually very, very expensive for these violent crimes that we calculate the effect of. Okay, so I'm going to show you one example here of the calculation. I'm not going to go into detail about the program, but just say that this is the R&R principles that program which is called Risk, Need and Responsibility. And once again, I'm not into the practical implementation of this, so don't ask me about this. This is a program that's aimed at parolees, so people who have been paroled from their sentence. So the target group that we use in respect to the 5 groups that we saw before is group 4, where individuals have actually received an unsuspended sentence. So they have been to jail and now they have gone out on parole. So, and we actually aim at reducing the share that will move on to receive more sentences. And the effect measurement that we use is this measurement from the United States, where they actually find a reduction in recidivism of 16% compared to a control group who hasn't been subject to this R&R program. So what do we do now when we insert this into the formula? Well, the P and I, which are the probability of having a success, is now 0.16 for all these areas I, which is sort of the different areas that I cover. This was the crime, this was the social security benefits, early retirement benefits, etc., all the ones that I mentioned before. And the difference, sort of the quantity of what we save, is the effect of the difference between groups 4 and 5. So basically we reduce the probability that you jump from group 4 to group 5 with 0.16, and then the difference of the amounts of these 2 groups is the result that we can save, right, from each group. Okay, so this shows the numbers that we have calculated for this Danish project. So of course this is based on Danish data, so these data of course will be different in other countries, but it basically shows the principle of the calculation. What we find here is there is a total potential gain from using R&R on Danish parolees in group 4 of about 9,000 euros per person over this 5-year period. So this is, you can say this is not much or it is much, and I'm not going to go into much detail about this. But what I can say is that we actually, if we multiply this number by the number of individuals who are in this target group, we basically end up with a total of about 10 million euros that can be saved, sort of could be a benefit of the total to the Danish society. If we look at sort of the distribution of the effects, where do we earn the money? Well, we earn the money basically mostly from the fact that people who are less criminal have a much better attachment to the labor market. So, sort of to put it roughly, people who don't commit crimes actually go to work. Of course, they maybe have a hard time finding a job and all this, but in the data, even after we have control for the fact that they have committed crime, we can see that they actually are much more likely to have a job when they stop their criminal career. So they earn a lot more labor income, and they pay more in taxes. So this is one of the very, very big effects of this. Also, there is a gain from not having to pay out as much in social security benefit and a little bit from early retirement benefit. And as you can see, there is actually a loss in the fact that we have to pay out more in education benefit to these individuals on average. As I said before, this is a short-term loss, but hopefully and probably a long-term gain. And finally, there is huge savings on costs on courts and policing and incarceration, and that was what we saw before. The costs of this area is much higher for these groups 4 and 5 than they are for the less hardened groups. Okay, let me move on to sort of my conclusions about these cost-benefit analysis. Why are cost-benefit analysis worthwhile? Well, and as an economist, I sort of like numbers, right? So I like the fact that we can get a single number as a sort of a result of whether this program is economically worthwhile. So this has sort of adds to transparency, and it has an intuitive appeal sort of to most people, and it also means that you could sort of talk to people on a level playing field that if we get numbers into it. Obviously, it's a very simple way of addressing a very complicated issue, but it's still sort of very intuitively appealing. Another advantage is that this could be carried out at many different levels. So you can have a local project, you can have a national project, you can have a project in cooperation with another country, and you can have a project aimed at one group and then a project aimed at another group. And basically what you can do when you carry out these cost-benefit analyses, you can sort of compare them at a level playing field. You get a resulting number for all these projects in principle, and you can sort of compare them to one another and see which one you want to continue with, or whether there are some that are too expensive, and sort of this makes it possible to compare projects. Of course, there are also some limitations here. One in particular, of course, is that these results are uncertain. And they obviously depend on the underlying assumptions for the calculations. One particular assumption that is important here is that we have assumed that these effects from one area, this is recidivism, can actually be translated to other areas, even though it hasn't sort of actually been proved in these effect measurements that we have been used. It's probably, I mean, we can see from the data that there is a correlation. There is indeed a correlation between how criminal you are and how much benefit you receive, or how much healthcare you use, or how much labor market attachment you have. So this correlation is true, right? But whether the effect of on recidivism is actually one-to-one able to be translated into other areas is doubtful, but there is an effect, but whether it's one-to-one, it's hard to say. Finally, the cost-benefit analysis, all these economic calculations that we carry out, we have to collect data from all these different areas, and we have to add them together, and we have to define different groups and measure different groups. All of this is sort of worth nothing if we don't have good effect evaluations of these projects to base the calculation on. Because if we don't have good effect evaluations, then basically the numbers that comes out of the calculations are well, uncertain at best and wrong at worst, right? So that's not a good idea. So suppose that you actually want to carry out cost-benefit analysis. So what do you need, right? You need quantitative evaluation of crime prevention programs, preferably good quantitative evaluations who have both a control group and a participant group. And then if you don't have one for your own program, you need to find one from a comparable program abroad, or even in your own country. Then you need access to some sort of data for these public transfers and healthcare, and and the cost of crime is also, of course, very important. How much does it cost, for instance, for the Hungarian police and prosecution service and incarceration services, sort of per crime? Well, that's an important measure, because, I mean, obviously, well, it is very, very important whether this is actually 1,000 euro, or it's 10,000 euro, or 20,000 euros. It's going to make a whole lot of difference in the calculation of this time. So we need to know it exactly, or not exactly at least, but we need to have a good estimate of it. Yes, that was basically it. I hope that you can take this a little bit further, and I would love to receive your questions afterwards if you have some, but otherwise I would like to say once again thank you for the invitation and thank you for your attention.